When people think of indigenous peoples, what comes to mind? Many people can think of teepees, traditional dress, old stories, and old ways of hunting. This is how I thought of indigenous peoples before I learned about them. I thought that all indigenous cultures were of the past, and that most indigenous people lived in remote communities and were not involved in modern society. Through this course, I learned that although many indigenous languages, traditions, stories, and ceremonies have fallen into disuse, many remain very much alive today. Some are practiced and shared by many indigenous and non-indigenous people today and are appreciated by both. Many have also adapted to life in modern Canada, evolving as society has grown and changed. It is common for many to see traces of indigenous cultures in contemporary art, music, education, community events, and more. The appreciation of many of these indigenous cultural traditions has led me to realize that there are many living cultures of indigenous peoples who continue to shape the country we know today. This documentary will look at the stereotype that the indigenous cultures are lost and of the past. It uses the stories of many indigenous people and their perspectives in documentaries and looks at how indigenous cultures are living and changing all the time. It also explores how indigenous cultures play a huge role in modern Canadian society today. To better understand the experiences of today's indigenous peoples, it is helpful to gain knowledge of the histories of the different groups of indigenous peoples in Canada, including First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Indigenous peoples and communities. Each of these, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit individuals and communities is from different linguistic, cultural, spiritual, and historical backgrounds. Colonization and government policies created many challenges for indigenous peoples to maintain their identities. Many actions of government and Christian organizations, such as putting indigenous children in residential schools and enforcing policies to take away their cultures and lands, have greatly hurt indigenous languages and cultures and created many broken communities. 3. Many indigenous people today continue to practice their identity and traditions. They are actively working to maintain, renew, and share their languages and cultural knowledge with others. They strive to create opportunities for the young and old to reconnect with their cultures and to celebrate their heritage. Storytelling continues to play an important role in indigenous cultures today. In the talking stone, the stone reminds the people of their responsibility to preserve cultural knowledge by saying, "You have heard my stories and you must keep them." The talking stone. The people are instructed to pass these stories on to their children and grandchildren so that future generations will remember their history and traditions. This message shows that storytelling is much more than entertainment. It is a way of preserving culture, sharing knowledge, and teaching important values. Although indigenous stories have been passed down for generations, they remain relevant today. Storytelling continues to strengthen cultural identity and ensure that important teachings are not forgotten. Another important lesson I learned through the course is that not all knowledge is meant to be shared publicly. Before taking this class, I assumed that information could simply be found online or in books. However, there is a lot of indigenous cultural knowledge that is dispersed with specific protocols. The First Peoples' principles of learning state that some knowledge is sacred and only shared with permission and/or in certain situations. Different First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities may have different rules regarding songs, dances, oral histories, ceremonies, and other cultural teachings. I used to think respecting indigenous culture meant learning about their history and ways of life and therefore appreciating them. But that's not all. Some knowledge is sacred and it needs to be respected within the boundaries of how and when it is shared. These cultural protocols are still very much alive and practiced in many indigenous communities today through their own indigenous values and ways of knowing. Indigenous cultures are also expressed through art, music, language, and traditional practices that continue to be used and appreciated today. Before taking this course, I assumed that many indigenous cultural traditions only existed in museums or history books. However, I learned that indigenous cultures remain active and visible throughout Canada. For example, Métis cultural traditions continue to be celebrated through fiddle, music, and jigging, a traditional dance style that remains popular at community gatherings and cultural events. Métis Nation of Ontario. These traditions have been passed down through generations and remain an important part of Métis cultural identity. Indigenous music more broadly continues to play an important role in many communities, bringing people together through singing, drumming, and cultural celebrations. Indigenous artists also create contemporary paintings, films, and digital artwork that incorporate traditional stories, symbols, and teachings while reaching modern audiences. Traditional crafts continue to be practiced and passed down to younger generations. Beadwork, carving, and regalia making are still important cultural traditions that reflect indigenous identities, histories, and values. These items are not simply displayed in museums, they continue to be worn, created, and appreciated within indigenous communities today. Teaching these important skills to future generations means that indigenous peoples are preserving the knowledge of their cultures for years to come. Indigenous peoples and communities are also working to preserve and revitalize their languages, to pass them on to future generations. With increasing numbers of schools and programs teaching indigenous languages and culture, younger generations of indigenous peoples are practicing and speaking their traditional languages and are connected to their culture and identity. The protection of indigenous languages is an important part of the overall protection of cultural knowledge and its continued use by future generations. As noted by the Assembly of First Nations, indigenous languages are an important part of Canada's cultural heritage and need to be recognized and protected. These are just a few examples of how indigenous cultures are not only remembered, but also practiced, shared, adapted, and appreciated by Canadians today. Indigenous cultures are very much alive and play an important role in Canadian society today. Learning about indigenous cultures and histories has changed my perspective. Before taking this course, I knew very little about indigenous peoples and their experiences. Many of the ideas I had were based on stereotypes or limited information. Through documentaries, stories, and class discussions, I realized that many stereotypes come from a lack of knowledge and understanding. I now have a greater appreciation for the diversity, resilience, and the contributions of indigenous communities. These lessons have also encouraged me to think more deeply about cultural identity. As an international student from China, I have experienced the cultural adaptation and the challenge of balancing different cultural influences. Moving to Canada taught me the importance of maintaining my own traditions while adapting to a new environment. Because of this experience, I can better understand the importance of cultural preservation and identity. I have learned that tradition and modern life are not opposites. They can exist together and strengthen one another. This is something many indigenous communities continue to demonstrate as they preserve their cultures while actively participating in modern society. To further explore this idea, I spoke with my friend Wallace Dai, a Chinese international student studying in Canada, about cultural identity and cultural preservation. Has learning about indigenous cultures changed the ways you think about your own cultural identity?
Oh yes, before learning about the indigenous perspective, I didn't think much about cultural preservation. Seeing indigenous communities work to protect their language, tradition, and the cultural knowledge made me appreciate my own cultural background more. It reminded me that the culture is an important part of who we are.
How do you stay connected to your culture while studying in Canada?
I'm fortunate that the Chinese culture is supported by a much larger population and is widely practiced around the world. Because of this, it is easier for me to maintain my cultural identity while living abroad. I stay connected to my culture by speaking Chinese with my family, celebrating Chinese traditional festivals such as Lunar New Year, and continuing to learn about share the Chinese history and the traditions. This practice helped me maintain a strong connection to my roots while adapting to life in Canada.
What is one lesson that people can learn from indigenous communities about culture and identity?
I think the biggest lesson is that the tradition and the modern life can exist together. indigenous community continue to preserve their cultures while participating in modern society. This showed me that people do not need to abandon their cultural identity to adapt to a changing world.
My perceptions of indigenous cultures before I embarked on this course were those of cultures of the past. Through the confined pages of textbooks and often misinformed films, as well as stereotypical views of media, my knowledge of indigenous peoples before this course was one-dimensional. I truly had no idea that there were very active and thriving indigenous peoples today, and that their cultures were just as relevant to today's society as any other. After studying indigenous perspectives, learning about their ways of knowing, and the specific works such as the talking stone and rabbit-proof fence, I gained much more knowledge and therefore much more of an appreciation of sacred knowledge and the cultural protocols that are an integral part of the indigenous cultures. I see now that these cultures are not only of the past but also of today and continue to play a significant role in our society. Indigenous peoples today strive to maintain their languages, stories, values, and practices in the modern world. They are not stagnant, yet they are not changing who they are. To move towards reconciliation, we must challenge stereotypes, learn from indigenous perspectives, and listen to the indigenous voices and cultures, histories, and sacred knowledge that they bring. We can learn so much from their experiences in this country and how they continue to grow and contribute to Canadian society today. Indigenous peoples are not only an important part of Canada's history, they are an important part of Canada's present and future. The Indigenous are not only an important part of Canada's history, they are an important part of today's Canadian society and future.